What would happen if insects went extinct? The unthinkable truth. We've all seen those nature docs that show us how important bees are to the ecosystem. Without bees, we wouldn't have many plants, and without plants, we wouldn't have many animals. It's a bit of a domino effect that could spell the end for us humans as well. But what if it wasn't bees or another pollinator that went extinct? What if it was all insects? Sure, we'd be rid of some annoying house guests like cockroaches, but what about all the other insects? That is when things get bad. Insects make up more than half of all known species on Earth. They're everywhere. And while we might not want to admit it, we rely on them for a lot more than just pollination. In fact, we depend on insects so much that if they disappeared tomorrow, our world would crumble very quickly. The first thing that would happen is that there would be no more buzzing in the summertime. That might sound nice at first, but within 24 hours, farmers would begin to panic. As soon as the sun came up, farmers noticed something was wrong. None of their crops were producing fruit. Farmers had assumed that there would be plenty of time to harvest their crops before the next planting season, but that would no longer be the case. The reason why is simple. Insects were no longer pollinating the plants. There are more than 200,000 different types of insects that help pollinate plants. With their disappearance, only the hardiest plants would be able to reproduce. And since there was no way for most plants to reproduce anymore, massive crop failures would occur worldwide. Farms would struggle to produce food. Supplies would dwindle and grocery store shelves would start to look emptier and emptier. Within 2 weeks, people around the world would start to starve. Not everyone, but enough to make the news. People living in densely populated areas would probably fare better than those living in remote places. Even then, it would only be a matter of weeks before supplies ran out. When they did, people would need to venture further and further into the wilderness to try and find food. Unfortunately, they'd find little sustenance out there. After all, the plants that did manage to reproduce wouldn't grow very large. After 1 month, the world would become unrecognizable. People who managed to survive the first month would notice a change in the world around them. Plants were dying back. Fields that once grew bountiful amounts of food now produced nothing. Forests were filled with dead trees. Gone were the days when people could simply walk outside and forage for berries, nuts, or edible plants. Those days were over. People would need to ration what little food they had left and try to make it last as long as possible. But while people struggled to stay alive, there was one group of animals that was doing quite well: birds. Since insects were no longer around, birds didn't need to worry about predators attacking them, so bird populations would explode. This would be especially true for predatory birds like hawks, because there would be no insect-eating birds to compete with them. Suddenly, the skies would belong to the birds of prey. At the same time, other animals weren't doing nearly as well. For example, all of the animals that ate meat would quickly run out of food. Hawks, wolves, spiders, foxes, owls, anything that ate meat would suddenly have no food source. There would be no birds for the hawks to eat, no smaller mammals for the foxes to hunt, no squirrels for the owls. All of these animals would need to find new food sources or die. Many wouldn't find a suitable replacement and would eventually pass away. 3 months after insects went extinct, the world would look completely different. After 3 months, the human race would be on the brink of extinction. There would be so little food available that people would be forced to eat bugs. Of course, people would probably prefer to eat something else instead, but there would be no other option. People would turn to the closest thing they could find to the food they once enjoyed. Some would prefer starvation. Even worse, people wouldn't even be able to enjoy their last meal of bug stew in peace. They'd constantly have to worry about being attacked by cannibalistic pigs. Since there would be no more predators to keep their numbers down, the pig population would explode. And pigs aren't picky eaters. They'll eat pretty much anything, including humans. 6 months after insects went extinct, cannibalism would run rampant. As you can imagine, there would be a lot of desperate people in this world. People would do anything to get their hands on food, even if it meant killing another person. Cannibalism would become widespread. Entire families would be wiped out as members turned on each other to satisfy their hunger. It would be an apocalyptic nightmare. 9 months after insects went extinct, the earth would be a barren wasteland. By this point, Virtually everyone would be dead. Only a handful of superhumans would remain. These people would roam the earth looking for food. They'd travel from town to town, scavenging whatever they could find. If they weren't careful, they could easily be killed by other survivors. But they'd also have to worry about being attacked by bears. That's right, bears would thrive in this new world. Not only would there be no humans to hunt them, but there would also be no bees to attack them. Humans aren't the only ones who fear bees. Bears have been known to absolutely hate bees. A single bee sting can cause massive swelling and excruciating pain. Imagine what would happen if a bear was stung multiple times. In some cases, a bear can even go blind if it gets stung in the eyes. Needless to say, bears would much prefer to live in a world without bees or any other insects. A year after insects went extinct, the world would still be recovering. After a year, the world would be unrecognizable. Most major cities would be abandoned and in ruins. The people that were still alive would have to live in constant fear of the elements. That's because trees would no longer be around to provide shade during the hot summer months. Without insects to pollinate the trees, the forest would die and turn into barren wastelands. Any animals that survived would be doomed. Any animal that ate meat would starve to death. Any animal that ate plants would also starve to death. It didn't matter if the animal was a herbivore, a carnivore, or an omnivore, it would die. All animals would die except for a few insects. Unfortunately, these insects would be the ones that humans hated the most. 2 years after insects went extinct, cockroaches would rule the earth. Cockroaches are one of the most hated insects in the world. They carry disease, invade homes, and are incredibly difficult to kill. Now, picture a world where humans no longer exist. Cockroaches would have free reign of the planet. They could enter buildings and feast on the remains of humans. They could roam the streets and do pretty much whatever they wanted. In short, cockroaches would be the new rulers of the earth, and they wouldn't be alone. There are millions of other insects that would survive the extinction of their kind. Termites would devour wooden buildings. Spiders would weave webs between skyscrapers. Ants would march across the land. Centipedes and millipedes would slither through the dirt. Mosquitoes would buzz around, biting anyone who wasn't already dead. In short, the earth would be a nightmare for anyone who wasn't a cockroach. 5 years after insects went extinct, life would return to normal. 5 years after insects went extinct, life would return to normal. At least that's what it would seem like. From afar, the earth would appear to be healing itself. Plants would be growing back, animals would be returning, and nature would be reclaiming what was once man's. But underneath it all, the earth would be dying a slow death. While some plants and animals would return, others wouldn't. The earth would never truly heal. It would be forever changed by the loss of insects. 10 years after insects went extinct, the world would die. Without insects to pollinate the plants would die. Without plants, the animals would die. And without animals, the world would die. Eventually, even the cockroaches would die. Now watch. What if I told you there's a way to save the world? Or check out, why hasn't nature cured itself yet?